Welcome to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. My name is James Carroll. Whoever you are, wherever you are in your life's journey, you're welcome here. Today is part 4 of our series on Hinduism. There should be 5 parts, so this is next to last. Today we're going to talk about sex, sexuality, and the divine feminine. I've been trying to think of the right word for this all morning. Salacious is maybe the wrong word, but one of those topics that everyone gets all excited about, and so I'm sure there's going to be a lot of interest in this particular talk, and I think my academic approach to the subject is probably going to disappoint most of you. Nevertheless, I think this is at least an interesting discussion, and so I hope we can learn something from it. I want to remind everyone of the class webpage. Hopefully it will be helpful to you. It has links to all of the videos and also additional readings for each of the topics. The URL for this is slides.google.com/view/comparative religion. And like I said, it should have a lot of good resources for you that should help. If you remember, last time we talked about the way of devotion as opposed to the Jnana path that was before that, was the way of wisdom. The way of devotion differed from the way of wisdom that instead of recommending that people act as ascetics, it recommended that people use love and grace and belief in their patron deity to achieve the goal of moksha, release from samsara, or rebirth. And so its primary expression is in the Hindu epics, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and the Bhagavad Gita, which we talked about, where, especially in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna appears and explains that if you do all these actions in the world, you don't have to renounce the world or go off and be a monk. You should do your duty, your dharma, but do it to me and renounce the results. And if you give up on the results and just do your duty for your duty and for me and consecrate all your actions to me, the goddess, then when you die, I will give you, by my grace, release from samsara. So this is almost a salvation by grace, whereas the previous path was a salvation by works sort of approach. Works and renunciation, I should say. And the primary worship practice in this tradition is puja. It is probably kind of a reclaiming of the older traditions that coexisted with the Vedas and the Harappan civilization, and that involves the giving of gifts to an icon of the deity, and then eventually taking darshan, where you see the deity face to face. So that was the sort of thing we discussed last time. Today we want to talk about sex, sexuality in Hindu thought, because it has a very interesting and different approach to sexuality than we're used to seeing in Christianity and some of the Western religions. And we also want to talk about the divine feminine, so the worship of gods, goddesses as opposed to just gods. So we'll talk about the difference between the gods and the goddesses and the worship of the goddesses, and how that relates to the Hindu view of sexuality. So we have a whole bunch of topics from the Kama Sutra to the Gita Govinda and Tantra, and then later Hindu Puritanism, which we'll probably push most of that out to the next class. But that is, of course, a modern shame for a sexual past, where there's an embarrassment almost about the sexual nature of some of the earlier traditions in modern Hinduism, influenced by the puritanical views that came over from England. So, these are, I always kind of list some resources, things you can use to learn more. I always list these first 2 for my Hindu classes, and for most of these religions we talk about, God is Not One, the 8 Rival Religions That Run the World and Why Their Differences Matter by Stephen Prothero is a really, really good introduction to comparative religion. And to those 8 religions specifically, he has 2 chapters dedicated to Hinduism. It's worth reading. And most of the topics we discuss he mentions, at least in passing. There's also an entire course on Hinduism by Mark M. Musi in Great Courses lectures. And that is also incredibly useful. If you're interested specifically in the topic of today, which is sexuality in Hindu tradition, but also in all the wider religious tradition, there's a great book called Sacred Sexuality, the Erotic Spirit of the World's Great Religions by George, I don't know how you say his name, Feuerstein, something like this. And I recommend this as well. It's good. I got a copy just this morning, and I've been furiously reading it as I get ready. So. Feuerstein. Thank you. So let's talk, as the very beginning, the role of pleasure in Hindu tradition. So if I were to ask you what role pleasure has in Christian tradition, usually you would say something along the lines of it's allowed in some instances, but mostly to be avoided, and we have to be careful not to use it in ways that are not allowed, because pleasure is one of those temptations. So you'd list it among the great temptations. So what is the role that pleasure plays in Hindu belief? According to Hindu tradition, there are several Purashastra, I knew how to say that once upon a time, and look up how I said it last class, because I was doing it right before. And these are the purposes of life. Why are we here? What is the very purpose of life? Well, it's to do our duty. It's to seek prosperity and economic value and pleasure, so long as our search for pleasure does not prevent us from doing our duty and achieving prosperity. So if we were to sit and find pleasure all day and not go to work and therefore not feed our family, that would be wrong. If we were to seek pleasure in a way that violated our duty to our neighbors, something like adultery, that would be considered wrong. But Kama is one of the purposes of life. And so seeking pleasure is acceptable. So from the very beginning, we have a tradition that disagrees with a puritanical view of pleasure. There's nothing wrong with pleasure. At the same time, the ultimate goal is moksha. And moksha is release from samsara. And it comes in the Upanishad tradition and in the Renunciar tradition from 2 classes ago, specifically by giving up attachment to the previous 3. I remember the way of devotion differed slightly by saying you can continue to have pleasure, continue to have prosperity, continue to have duty. You just do it without attachment to the results. But in Jnana Yoga, you had to give up attachment to the previous 3. So we have a very interesting dichotomy where pleasure is acceptable. It's even one of the purposes of life, but it's also something that attachment to could prevent moksha, the ultimate goal and release. So the life cycle of a person, they would seek dharma, artha, kama during the first part of their life, and then they would, as they got older, they would renounce everything, put on orange robes and go off seeking moksha and give up everything that came before and try to not be attached to anything and give up all their possessions, stop having sex, etc. Now, in the way of devotion, as I said, they changed that idea. Don't go off. Don't renounce everything. Try to find salvation in the midst of dharma, artha, and kama. From that tradition will come the tantric tradition, where we attempt to seek release not in spite of kama, but through kama itself. We will now seek moksha. We'll talk about that as we reach the end of the class. But remember this idea already that pleasure is acceptable, because within that we then get the Kama Sutra. You notice Kama was the name for one of the goals of life, pleasure. Sutras are teachings or books of, think of them almost like chapters in the Bible, right? And then so you'll have in Buddhism the sutra on mindfulness, the Mindfulness Sutra, the Diamond Sutra. So we have sutras, and those are names for different teachings on different subjects. The Kama Sutra is then the teachings or the sutra of pleasure. It was written by someone named Vatashanaya, something like that, Malahagda, probably somewhere between 400 BC and 300 CE, which is a long range, and we don't really know when it was written. He says specifically that he says, I have lived celibate all these years while I write this text about all the techniques of pleasure so that I could do them, with a pure heart, etc., whatever that means. And it's almost like an encyclopedia. He's gone through all the different techniques of pleasure and written them down for us. And so it's a manual for finding pleasure, in this case specifically sexual pleasure. The topics of interest are, of course, heterosexuality and how to have heterosexual relations. In fact, if you ever Google Kama Sutra and go to the image search, you'll see a bunch of manuals of sex positions. And that's what we usually think of when we think of the Kama Sutra, is all the different sex. Some of them I can't imagine any human being could actually bend in those ways and actually make that work, but whatever. So that's the Kama Sutra, ways of having sex. Lots of manuals about how to have sex and how to have better sex. But it also mentions interesting topics like homosexuality, a third gender, and even briefly bisexuality. And it does all of these things without seeming condemnation, which is an interesting an interesting perspective compared to what we're used to seeing today. It also has a lengthy section on several subjects that it then will actually say are bad. So unlike its references to heterosexuality and homosexuality, it will every once in a while will mention a practice and then say, but don't do this. One of them that it mentions specifically is adultery. And so that one is a really good example of this, of what I'm talking about, because in the section on adultery, it says it has about 5 pages on techniques for seducing another man's wife. And I'm not kidding. And it tells you how. If you want to do this, here's how you do it. Here's how you go about it. Here's how you trick her into spending time with you. And here's how you praise her so she'll pay attention to you. Here's how you don't get caught by her husband. And it's a how-to manual. And then at the end of this how-to manual, it says, oh, and by the way, don't ever do this because it's wrong. And then you have to wonder, why did you spend 3 or 4 pages telling me how to do it if you don't think I should do it? So it's a really interesting kind of morality tale that you also sort of see in Victorian England. There's a famous book called The Memoirs of Fanny Hill by a guy named John Sulland. And the reason it's famous is because it was banned. It's one of the world's most banned books ever, one of the first banned books and the most banned books, because it's probably the world's first pornographic text, kind of in prose, not in pictures, but because of that, it's been banned. And it tells the story of this person who goes out and has all these sexual experiences, and then when she's all done, she meets a man, and they ride off into the sunset and live happily ever after. And then it concludes with about a paragraph saying, and this is how we really should live. We shouldn't do all those things I spent, an entire book describing. Now, there's no doubt that no one would waste the time to spend an entire book describing all that if it wasn't for the purpose of titillation. And nevertheless, they end with this moralizing, but don't do it. And when I read the Kama Sutra passages on adult, that's how it felt. I mean, it was trying to titillate, and then when it was done, it said, oh, by the way, don't do this. I kind of have a hard time taking him seriously when he says, don't do that after spending pages describing it. The same way I don't take that ending in the Memoirs of Fanny Hill seriously. It just doesn't make any sense. So this is the Kama Sutra. Like I said, I have a copy here, translated. It's in the Oxford World Classics. It's a new translation by a guy named Wendy Doniger and Sudril Kakar. And I found its introduction to be nearly impenetrable. I spent my life studying religion, and he was speaking in such scholarese that it was half the book was his introduction, and I couldn't tell what he was trying to say. Maybe that says something about me, or maybe it says something about the book, but I don't really have a lot of good recommendations for translations, but this is the one I happen to have, and for whatever it's worth. The other thing I note about this is it's an incredibly sexist text, because it says these sorts of things are allowed by men and these are allowed by women, and it illustrates a worldview that was written a long time ago, and as such, some of the blatant sexism was just horrifying. But that's still, from a scholastic perspective, it's an illustration of where they were at and what they believed, etc. So how do we get there in the Hindu tradition, from the beginning to a place where someone would write a book describing techniques for sexuality and it would become a Hindu kind of classic? How did that happen? So let's go through what we have. In Hindu tradition, there are geological layers. I've showed you this before. An Indus Valley civilization, an Aryan civilization, philosophical Hinduism, devotional Hinduism, and modern Hinduism. And as we go through those layers, we can follow the thread of sexuality and how sexuality is defined and viewed as we move through the traditions. So in the Indus Valley civilization, we have these female figurines, a lot of them, and they're very old, and they indicate a certain interest in the female as a divine figure. So we already have goddesses to worship. Goddesses to worship, and they're divine, and they're connected to fertility, and they seem connected to sexuality. Male sexuality is usually represented by bulls, horns, large flanks, this sort of thing. But the female sexuality is represented by the female form itself, as compared to these images of male sexuality. Except for the Lingam. Let me see. Here we go. So on the right, we have a lingam excavated from Harappa. So 5,000 years old. It's very, very old. And these are, of course, phallic representations of the male sexuality used in ritual, and we'll talk about how in a minute. At the bottom is a much later version of the same thing from a Hindu temple. So how do they use these and what are they for? Well, this one is a Buddhist version, and separating Buddhism and Hinduism is very difficult. But in this case, we have 4 carved Buddhas surrounding this lingam. And so it has mixed representation. Sometimes it is the mound of creation. So when you look at creation accounts, usually the world is covered in water, and as the waters recede, a mountain arises out of the waters, and the dry land appears. So sometimes the lingam is the mountain, sometimes it is a pillar that represents creation, and Shiva or the Buddha steps out of the pillar, but most often it is explicitly a phallus, representing, again, the creative power. So it's still connected in that sense to creation. We find a whole bunch of these things next to rivers, sometimes carved in the rocks around the rivers. This, of course, is the lingam, and this is what we call the Yoni, and it's a representation of the female anatomy. And so by uniting the female and male anatomy, we're representing, again, the power of creation, and it's placed to the rivers, at the sources especially of the rivers, because they want the river to be a representation of fertility, to be able to water their crops, etc. So there's a connection between sexuality and fertility represented here. This is Angkor Wat, probably the most famous temple ever built. Everyone should try to go see it, and I include myself. It's one of my to-do lists before I die. And it's this beautiful, beautiful Buddhist temple with originally Hindu iconography and representations. And inside the holiest place, in this most sacred building, it's beautiful spires, 5 major spires in a large temple. And as you proceed into the most inner sacred space, it gets dark, and the roof comes down, the floor comes up, and the rooms get small and cramped and dark. And as you get back in there, I think in the West we would often associate the most sacred space as big, wide, open. The courtyard almost of this place is an incredible sight. But the most sacred space for them was dark, in the back, cramped. And again, this kind of contradicts our view of what is sacred and beautiful. And as you go there, at the very center of this small, dark room is a Shiva Lingam, a representation of the phallus and the yoni, the female and male organs united. And so one of the questions is, why is that there? And what has happened? And so what we need to, I think, represent that the room is gotten dark because this is the moment of creation. Not the moment of creation of a person or the birth of a Buddha or a god. This is the birth of the universe. And so you're in the dark room because in the beginning, darkness was upon the face of the deep. And then God said, let there be light. So you're going back to the start. And this small room is the womb. And the Shiva Lingam is that uniting of the male and female principles that enabled the creation of the entire world. And then you leave and you walk out of the womb and into the courtyard, and the sun shines and the spires of mountains, 5 mountains, sacred mountains, spread above your eyes, and you're born. And you see the world in all its created glory as you come out of that sacred room. So, again, this view of sexuality is connected to not just the birth of a person, but of the universe itself. The rituals performed here involve lots of things, but let's see. This is, on the left, a royal Brahmin priest pours a libation of ghee, a clarified butter, over the lingam, a symbol of Shiva, and the Yoni, while the Khmer king kneels reverently. The liquid would run off the channel and seep into the ground, ensuring fertility. This ceremony, which took place in the innermost Holy of Holies of the royal temple complex, confirmed the divine kingship and ensures the continuity of the empire. The spout always points towards the south. This was from both of these pictures are from the National Geographic Society, Splendors of the Past, Lost Cities of the Ancient World, from 1981. And the other is another representation of the most sacred ritual from National Geographic. You can immediately see, I think, that the material being poured over it represents the semen. And so again, this is the sexual act of creation of the universe. This is a modern version of the same ritual. Your Lord Shiva devotees offering milk, flowers, fruits, and bell leaves on the Shiva Lingam for seeking divine blessings in a city temple at the celebration of Mahadevi in New Delhi in 2009. And so this is the same ritual, and you notice they're pouring the clarified butter over the lingam. So we see that this plays a role in the meaning of Hindu temples, in the rituals performed in the most sacred places of these temples, and in the most extreme representation, I think, is from the temples of Kama Sutra, Khajuraho. Thank you, Khajuraho. And it's you notice that it evokes the cosmic mountain, and each of these kind of pillars is both a lingam representation and a representation of the cosmic mountain. And there's more than one. It's almost a fractal image of mountain after mountain after mountain piling up, again pointing to that moment of creation. This is another view of the same thing. And if we get in closer, you see what I mean by mountain after mountain. But also these are phallic images. And we get a close-up of one of them. Inside is a statue of the deity. I left that picture out because it's not terribly relevant, but around it is a channel so that you can circumambulate or walk around in a circle around the sacred center. And this is a close-up of that carving. Do you notice how each of those little mountain representations were carved very deep through these stones? I can't imagine the amount of effort it took to carve each of these statues. You see how intricately carved they are, and then placed fractally on top of each other. But surrounding each of those niches are also a whole slew of statues. They're beautiful, I think, carved, but they're also incredibly and intentionally erotic. So when we go to a temple to worship, we don't usually expect to see erotic images and paintings on the walls. That's just not what we would go to do. But this is, again, a very different sensibility, and I want to expose you to it because it's so different. You go to their temple, you see these beautiful mountains representing the creation of the world, and around it are all these statues of beautiful, large-breasted women and men, and they are engaged often in erotic acts. And some of them are just different. This is a person either sneezing or yawning or something. I'm not quite sure what she's doing. But you'll notice they're also kissing and engaged sometimes, again, in these Kama-related acts that I don't think people really bend that way. So Kama-related arts are common in the Hindu temples. These scenes include courtship, amorous couples, and scenes of intimacy or sexual position. This one is especially, I don't quite think people bend this way. But this gives you an example of exactly how extreme these images get. And they are all around this temple everywhere you look. I had to cut them because I just started collecting all these pictures and I realized I had way too many to include because there's thousands of these things. So what are they there for? This is from an 11th or 12th century text describing the reason for these images in the temple. He says, in this context, here are the rationale for erotic sculpture panels. I will explain them according to the received tradition among sculptors. Kama is the root of the world's existence. Now, Kama is pleasure, remember, as in Kama Sutra. Pleasure is the root of the world's existence. All that is born originates from Kama. That's that moment of the Shiva Lingam inside the Holy of Holies of the temple. It is by Kama also that the primordial matter and all beings eventually dissolve away. Without passion of Shiva and Shakti, Shiva being the male and Shakti being the female form, creation would be nothing but a figment. Nothing from the birth to death occurs without activation of Kama, pleasure. Shiva is manifest as the greatest Linga. Linga is the pillar, we just talked about. Shakti, essential form, is the Yoni. That is the base that the pillar is placed upon. By their interaction, the entire world comes into being. This is called the activity of Kama, pleasure. Canonical erotic art is an extensive subject in authoritative scriptures. As they say, a place devoid of erotic imagery is a place to be shunned. By tantric authority, such places are considered inferior and to be avoided, as if tantamount to the layer of death, of impenetrable darkness. You see, because before there was that moment of the uniting of the Shiva Lingam, there was darkness and nothingness. And so pleasure and passion and Kama are the origin of all things, including the universe itself. Now, so this has come a long way from just saying pleasure is one of the acceptable activities of mankind, but moksha is the ultimate, which requires relinquishment of passion. This goes the next step and says passion is itself a sacred act to be embraced for its own sake and its own ritual beauty and efficaciousness. And so, we talked about the epics, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana last time, which was the primary example of Bhakti yoga. We also have erotic passages. In both of those two texts, there are erotic passages, but the most erotic of the Hindu texts is the Gita Govinda. It is sometimes called the Hindu Song of Songs. So if you're not familiar, the Bible has an erotic poem in it called Song of Songs, which is worth reading. But it is clearly erotic love poetry, and it's in the Bible. The Gita Govinda is the same sort of thing, but it's the Hindu equivalent thereof. And it talks about the exploits of of Krishna and one of his consorts, Radha, I believe. He has so many different consorts, I get confused. And it tells the story of how Krishna is a child and he looks up and the skies are getting dark and he's afraid. I'm not exactly sure what that's about. And then later he's grown up and he has intercourse with Radha, but then he wanders off and plays a flute and he finds a bunch of cow girls who are out bathing and he lures them away with his flute, and then while they're bathing he steals their clothes and then he looks upon all of their naked bodies. And of course, that's against the rules in Hinduism. You're only supposed to see your spouse naked, so he marries them all. Then he has thousands of years worth of lovemaking with all of these women, and then he comes back to Radha, and he and Radha have sex again, and the poem ends. Now, this poem, just exactly like the Song of Songs, is interpreted allegorically. This is Krishna playing his flute and leading away the cowherd girls. So his union with his consort is the union of Atman and Brahman. So if you remember from back before, we talked about the soul, the Atman, being one with the true nature of all reality, the Brahman. And it's about unity and multiplicity. You see, when he and his consort are one, there is unity. That is the unity of all things. All things are one. It's the ultimate idea of Hinduism. But then when he's off with the cowhole girls, all things also feel as if they are multiplied. And there's multiplicity. But that is an illusion, and you have to come back to the unity in the end. And so there's also passages where Radha longs for Krishna and is missing him. If you've ever been in that moment of new love where you just can't stop thinking about somebody and they're not there, and so you sit up all night thinking about them, you know what that feels like? So he says, how astonishing. With her body afflicted by the pain of Cupid's fever, her mind had become exhausted for a long time by thinking of sandalwood, the moon, and the lotus, tolerating this somehow, meditating in a solitary place only on you, her beloved, whose body could cool the fever. She maintains her life for a few moments more. I'm staying alive for a few more moments, waiting for you to show up. This is Radha when he's off with these cowhole girls, wishing he would come back because she's missing him. This is interpreted as the longing we have for God. So, again, there's an allegoric interpretation here. The same allegory, same interpretation. It is applied to the Song of Solomon in most Jewish and Christian circles. But it expresses this idea that how we feel about God and how we long for God when we're away and wish that we could be one and united with God is that same emotional longing that people have when they're apart from their lover and wish they were together. So several commentators that I've read have called the Gita Govinda the most erotic literature in all of religious tradition, beating Song of Solomon hands down. And so for whatever that's worth, if you want to go look that up, I have a translation, but it's 99.9% commentary, and it's got 1% Gita. You can read the Gita Govinda online, and it's a few pages, and this is a book of how many 100 pages? 300, 400, 450 pages of commentary on something that takes a couple pages to read if you just read the poem itself. I never got all the way through this, but I did read the poem. This is by H.H. Bon Swami, or Bahanu, B-H-A-N-U, Swami, called the Gita Govinda with commentary. So again, if you want that, that's interesting, but it is long. So this is the heart of what we would consider the view of sexuality as a sacred thing in Hindu tradition, not just as something to be allowed, not just as something to be eventually superseded in renunciation, but something that is itself sacred and desirable and representative of our longing for God and unity with God. Within that same vein, there is a worship of the feminine in Hinduism. So not only is sex a beautiful thing, but Hindus don't just worship gods, they worship goddesses. So the Hindu Trinity is often called Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the sustainer, and Shiva, the destroyer. However, Brahma is almost never worshipped. He's almost thought of as the god of the deists who creates everything and then kind of goes away to let it run. And then Vishnu comes in and takes over. So Brahma is not a terribly important deity. And when Hindus talk about there are three branches of Hinduism. You can think of Hinduism as a conglomeration of different religions. It's not one religion, it's a conglomeration of different religions, each one worshiping a different deity, and Hinduism is kind of this overarching loose grouping of these. And the three most famous are Vaishnavism, Shaivism, and Shaktivism, which is the worship of Vishnu, Shiva, and the Mahadevi. So there are three main branches of Hinduism, and they don't have to do with Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. They have to do with Vishnu, Shiva, and the Mahadevi, or the mother goddess, which leads us to Shaktivism. Remember, Shakta is the female principle, and Shaktivism is then the religious worship of the goddess. So it's one of the three main branches of Hinduism today, of Bhakti-style Hinduism, includes the worship of the goddess, usually described as the singular goddess. Now, there are multiple goddesses, but this is true of the gods too, but in In worship of the Mahadevi, it's often more explicit. They will talk about worship of the singular goddess under the idea that all of the goddesses are different incarnations, different aspects of the one goddess. Again, that is true of the gods too, but they're not always as explicit about it. So some of the goddesses that we'll talk about are Sarasvati. She is famous as the wife of Brahma, but remember, Brahma is not often worshipped. Sarasvati, however, is often worshipped. She's a very important goddess. Shrines and temples to her everywhere, usually with her god absent. So this is another interesting thing, is the gods of Hinduism are almost never worshipped without the goddess present. Usually the god is there with the goddess, but the goddess is often worshipped by herself. So she is the goddess of knowledge, music, art, wisdom, learning. Students are especially fond of her, and students will often pray to her before tests and that sort of thing. Again, an important goddess, far more important than her husband. Lakshmi is also the goddess who is married to Vishnu. She is the goddess of wealth, fortune, and prosperity. And yet again, we also see her in circumstances where we do not see Vishnu, but we almost always see Vishnu in connection with Lakshmi. And Krishna, of course, is an incarnation of Vishnu, and so we find Radha and the other people are incarnations of Lakshmi. So the Gita Govinda is a story of Lakshmi and Vishnu in two incarnations. Parvati, on the other hand, is almost always worshipped with Shiva. She's not usually worshipped alone. She is the wife of Shiva, and she's the goddess of fertility, love, beauty, marriage, children, devotion, as well as divine strength and power. And the reason she is not worshipped alone is because as a goddess of fertility, it is the act of uniting her with Shiva that creates fertility. So as a fertility goddess, she is the exception where she's not worshipped alone. She's usually worshipped with her husband in the act of sexual union, because that is the origin of fertility. We also have goddesses who are single, meaning they are not married to one of the famous gods. Durga is one of these, and she's a warrior goddess. The story of Durga is fascinating. Apparently there was a buffalo demon, and I will not even try to say his name, who attacked the realm of the gods, and Shiva and Vishnu got together and said, we need to defeat this person, and all the gods got together and they fought a great war, and the demons were winning. Even Shiva and Vishnu could not defeat this being, so they created the Durga out of their anger. Then the divine feminine rose up and beat back the demons, and then came back to Shiva and Vishnu and said, and if you ever need me again, I'll come back. Because I know that, and the term impotent is used, you are impotent without me, and so I will defeat your enemies for you. So you think of masculine usually as the warrior form, and in this case the warrior form is feminine, and she defeats enemies that they cannot. And she is the goddess in her anger. The more frightening version is Kali. Kali is usually painted black, sometimes with a forked or long tongue. She has fangs, and she drinks blood. She haunts the cremation grounds. She usually has a ring of human skulls around her neck, and she is the goddess of death. And one of the questions is, why would somebody worship a being like this? That always comes to mind when we get kind of these. We would almost think of them as evil, and yet they serve a purpose, and people worship them. Why? And I think it's important to remember that think back to Mesopotamia, people were trying to personify the realities of nature and pacify the realities of nature. And one of the realities of nature is that life, as symbolized by the goddess, the source of life, comes most often through death. I mean, we don't survive unless we eat. And we eat other things that are alive. And we owe our existence to countless things that we have killed in order to survive ourselves. And this is part of the reality of nature that they are recognizing and personifying in Kali. In fact, the origin of the English word, the thugs, comes from a list of Kali worshippers who, in the 18th and 19th century, early 19th century, would go around as respectable businessmen during the day, and at night they would worship Kali by going out and committing horrible crimes and murders in her name. Human sacrifice has been known to be offered to Kali from time to time. It's been outlawed for years, but every once in a while, even today's stories will pop up of human sacrifice being offered to Kali. Now, before we condemn all of Hinduism for this particular bit, remember, Hinduism is a collection, much like Christianity is, and that's kind of like condemning a Catholic for something a Jehovah's Witness does. That's a very loose analogy, but I kind of want to make this point, that Hinduism is a diverse set of religious traditions, and in the worship of Kali there has been some dark pasts to it, including human sacrifice. She is also a goddess of smallpox. She's thought of as the originator of the disease, smiting people who displease her with the disease, but also having the power to cure them of the disease if they offer sacrifice to her. Animals are still offered as sacrifice to her commonly, and again, every once in a while stories crop up of human sacrifice. And so that is actually the origin of the English term, the thugs. Today it sort of has a racist connotation, but it's originally has to do with Kali worshippers. And it has to do with criminals who commit horrible crimes in the name of their goddess. This brings up an interesting observation. If you were following along, all the dependent goddesses, meaning goddesses who were married, were goddesses of wonderful things like fertility, wealth, knowledge, happy thoughts. Right? And the independent goddesses that I've listed were goddesses of war, battle, lust, death, blood drinking, human skulls. You get the picture. And so this has not escaped the notice of people interested, especially in gender studies. People who are interested in the history of gender studies have noticed that there is something going on here in how the Hindu tradition is viewing women, specifically in their need to be connected to a man. There is a famous line from the Laws of Manu that we will talk about when we do modern Hinduism next class. It says, "A woman is never fit for independence." And that passage refers to the idea that when she's a child, she's under the direction of her father. When she's an adult, she's under the direction of her husband. And when she is a widow, she should go to her son or to her brother, etc., who are supposed to take care of her, because she should never be left alone because she can't take care of herself, etc. It's interesting that's how they think of women today and their role in society. It's interesting to try to apply that to what they're doing with the goddesses who are independent versus dependent. But there may be something else going on as well. The goal of femininity in Hindu thought is the creation of children. None of the gods and goddesses have children, except in very special circumstances. There's a story of Vishnu and his wife having a child. Shiva, and his spouse have a child, and she creates the child from the ground by molding clay. But they don't have children in the normal sense, and the reason for that is because there's a view in the ancient world, in most ancient traditions, that children are what mortals have, and they are our compensation for our mortality. And what the gods have is immortality, and they do not then have children. And so there's a view that the goddesses are angry because to some extent they're thwarted in what would otherwise be part of their purpose. They're childless, and that's the origin of their anger. The other view is that the married goddesses have avoided some of that anger because they have had kind of a cooling influence from their spouse. So let's talk about that for a minute. What are the gender roles? Now, there is some sexism in this idea that the women are not set to be independent, but there is something counter stereotypical about the roles assigned to the various deities. For example, if we're in Chinese tradition, and this kind of matches our thinking, the yin is black, feminine, and passive. The yang is white, masculine, and active. Men are active. We go out and play sports. Women are passive. They stay home and cook. That's the stereotype that we have of men and women in the West. As horrible as that is, that's our stereotype, right? But in their stereotype, women are active, They have Shakti, the active creative force, and they work on the earth. The earth is feminine and active. The male is passive, cool, and operates in the heavens, the celestial realm. So the masculine is celestial, the feminine is earthly. That is the opposite of Egypt, but the same as, kind of we talk about Mother Earth. We still have that same. The earth is feminine, the sky is masculine. The opposite was the case in Egypt. But they also have the active and passive roles backwards from what we would assign. Notice red. Red is a fiery, hot color. White is a cool, cold color. There's also a connection, I believe, between the menstrual flow, red, and the semen, white. In this mandala on the left, we have the combination of the white and the red, the masculine and the feminine. I don't know if you've ever looked at these mandalas, but the idea is to represent the sacred center. The center is here in the middle. And one of the things you can't do is ever draw the center. Like, how do you draw a center? If you put a dot, no matter how small it is, it's not the center. Right? The center is an infinitesimally small point. All you can do is point at it. Well, that's very, very connected with the idea of Brahman, right? Atman and Brahman. You can't actually describe it, you can only point at it. So what you do is you draw all that surrounds the center in a method that points at the center. And the technique for doing this is the mandala. These T-shaped things on the edge are actually the shape of the gates to various Hindu and Buddhist temples. So here we have a T-shape, a T-shape. There's 4 gates, the square of the earth, the circle of the heavens, and the masculine and feminine united in this fractal pattern that points at the very center of the entire thing, and around it are the lotus blossoms, etc. And the whole thing is actually a 3-dimensional picture of a stupa, which is a mound representing the mound of creation and the phallic element. So it's a uniting of the male and the feminine while pointing at the sacred center. So Shiva without Shakti is a corpse is actually a famous phrase. And what it means is that the feminine aspect is what gives life. The masculine aspect has consciousness and gives consciousness to that life. But it is passive, and it is so passive that without the feminine with it, it would be dead. This is the reason that the male deities are almost never shown in their temples without the goddess next to them. They have to have the goddess there to provide them with life. But the goddess can exist on her own in a way that the male can't. But when she does, she lacks the cooling, passive, calming influence of the male. And so in that sense, she can be dangerous. And thus we have Kali and the Durga, etc. So again, these are stereotypes, but they don't match our stereotypes in some important and interesting ways. And what is more important to me is that there is a view that the two are equally important. Now, there's stereotypes associated with them, but they are each cosmic principles that must be there and must be connected for real life and creation and peace, and etc. to take place. And that requires the worship, both of the masculine divinity and the feminine divinity, which is, again, very different than what you see in Christianity and Judaism, where you have a male deity and just a male deity. In the Hindu view, that deity would be dead, lacking the feminine attribute that it needs. And by worshiping the masculine and the feminine directly and recognizing the feminine as worthy of worship, there is something there that is perhaps valuable and something we in the West have missed in our culture and in our stereotypes. Which brings us to Tantra. This is the last subject we're going to talk about today. Tantra originates in the medieval period. Tantra means a path or a technique. Well, it literally means a web or a weave or a loom. So it's weaving threads together. But it's come to mean a path or technique, specifically a technique for arriving at moksha, or liberation. And it is not just a Hindu thing. In Shaktivism, Tantra is the method of achieving liberation. So if you are one of those three paths, where you're worshiping Shiva, worshiping Vishnu, or you can be Shaktivism, the worship of the goddess, Tantra is connected very closely to Shaktivism in Hinduism. But it's also connected to Vajrayana Buddhism, the diamond path, which influenced Tibet. And it's also present in Jainism and Jain traditions. So this is a tri-religious set of ideas that show up in Buddhism, they show up in Hinduism specifically as part of the worship of the goddess, and they show up in Jainism. There are several Sanskrit texts, the Samhitras and the Agamas, that are kind of the origin of this. And so when we talk about Tantra, it's often hard to define, but it's sometimes described as the traditions that come from those texts, although that is not quite accurate. Tantra was a secret tradition passed from guru to student. And some of that tradition was written down in those texts, but some of it was never written down. And so it's very difficult to decide today if you come up with a tradition, well, is this authentic? Well, you'd have to trace it back, and you just can't do that. And that's very difficult to do. Then there's what I'm going to call Western Tantra, and I hesitate to call anything inauthentic, because any religious practice that people experience or have a religious experience through is an authentic religious experience for them. But, I mean, we got books like The Tantric Jesus. Where does that come from? Tantric Massage. I have not read any of these books. I just picked the top 3 hits from Amazon to give you an idea of the sort of stuff that shows up. Tantric Sex, Step-by-Step Guide to Learning the Art of Tantric Sex. These, and then there's workshops that you can pay, and you can get some guru to come and teach you how to have better sex, or usually better sex. And they claim to be passing on tantric traditions. I'm not going to call them inauthentic in the sense that people are having religious experiences through these things, but this is not the Tantra of medieval Hinduism. I'm going to read what one scholar of religion said about this. He said, "Therefore, if we want to understand tantric practice in depth, we must still seek out a guru and hope that he or she will initiate us. A remote possibility, especially if the guru is authentic. The tantrism taught by such New Age gurus as the late Bhagavan Osho Rajneesh bears little resemblance to genuine tantrism, this is also true of these books. I remember certain pieces of the tantric tradition were written down, and New Age practitioners have attempted to appropriate those traditions from those written pieces. But Tantrism is specifically a tradition that is supposed to be passed guru to student. It's also usually considered an advanced form of yoga or practice, and you're supposed to have practiced and mastered other forms of yoga before a real tantric master will accept you as one of their students. So you should go out, if you really are interested in Tantra, you should go out and you really want to learn, you should go out and master a couple other yogic practices, then go find yourself a master in India somewhere and beg him to teach you, or her to teach you. This is the other thing, these will often be passed on by female gurus. And if you're really lucky, maybe in about 20 years, someone will take you on as a student and you could learn authentic Tantra. And you would then be expected not to tell anyone else what that is like. So the very secret nature of the tradition makes it difficult to describe, and it's certainly not going to be passed on in a book called Tantric Sex. The other thing I should point out is that you should be careful trying to practice Tantra on your own, because it is supposed to be taught guru to student, and it is supposed to be something that you've mastered other techniques first. So there is this attempt, especially New Age circles, to practice Tantra on your own, learn from these books, etc., and I kind of recommend against that. Its purpose is moksha. It's another technique for reaching moksha. We've had a whole bunch of them in Hinduism, from the Kama Yoga, to the Jnana Yoga, to the Bhakti Yoga, and now I have the Tantric Yoga, which is very related to Bhakti Yoga, but its purpose is to end the cycle of rebirth and death and to achieve liberation. That's that sweet cake passed out by Ganesha, or by Gamapada. And so it has several elements. Mantras, geometric patterns and symbols. Mantras are these things you say, special words. Geometric patterns are symbols. Those are the mandalas. We just showed you one of those. Representations and point at the sacred center. Gestures, mudras. The macking of the microcosm within one's body to the macrocosmic elements outside the body. This is Kundalini Yoga. It's often also accompanied with touching different parts of the body and pronouncing them, the sacred mandala mudras for each part of the body. Mantras, for each part of the body. And I find very interesting connections to, especially touching different parts of the body, to the initiatory rituals of Mormonism, which are fascinating to me. Maybe not interesting to everybody, but for me that's also a fascinating connection. There's also an assignment of icons and sounds, meditation techniques, ritual worship, initiation, and sometimes ritualized sexual union. Sometimes that's symbolic, sometimes it's literal. And it is that last piece that has made people in the West fascinated with Tantra to the point that we write books where we claim that Tantra will teach you how to have better sex. That was never the goal of Tantra. It's not what Tantra is supposed to be about, but it does sometimes, not always, involve sexual ritual. So here's that example of the mandala that we've discussed that points at the sacred center by having the symbol of the uniting of the male and the feminine. That's where that sacred sexual ritual would come into play, because there's this ritual, or there's this theological concept of the uniting of the male and the feminine as the origin of the universe. And if you want to find your one unity with the universe, this is one way to do it. There's also this description of the Kundalini Yoga and the chakras. So chakras show up in lots of Far Eastern traditions. They're the center of powers, and chi supposedly flows through them. And the Kundalini is a bundle of chi energy, something like that bundles at the base of the spine that is released. Now, it's at the base of the spine because it's connected with sexual energy. And so it's a sexual energy that is released through certain ritual practices and then travels up the chakras and out through the top of the head and then connects you to the rest of the universe. And this is one way of achieving moksha, or recognition of the unity of Atman and Brahman. I want to say something about the Kundalini sort of thing. I have several kind of New Age friends who talk about the Kundalini experience, and they've described it, and the chakras and the chi and all that stuff. Now, my bias is not important. This is a class to understand religion, not to tell you what I believe about it. But I want to back up into what I believe for just a minute. As a scientist, I don't believe there's such a thing as chi, some weird energy that we have not yet discovered as the scientific community. However, when I was a kid, I took karate. And I was a little kid, and I was trying to break a board. You know, the teacher would hold up a board, and I was supposed to kick it, and I just could not break this board because I was a little kid, you know. And she taught me all the technique for kicking, and I could not break the board. And then she said, I want you to imagine your chi. And it flows, you know, from your head down to your feet and then out through your kick and then kick through the board. And I would do this visualization thing she taught me. And dang it, I broke the board. So for whatever this is worth, there is a mental exercise that involves imagining the movement of these forces that creates a real physical experience. That, I've talked to a lot of people who claim to have had this sort of experience of moving their chi through their chakras and waking their kundalini, and some of them have described it as a painful sort of experience, but when I talk to them, they all have a very similar story to tell. That means either they've been seeded by the texts they've been reading to tell them what they should expect, and so they're feeling what they should expect, or it means there is a real psychological mental phenomenon that takes place and can be awakened by certain meditative techniques that many humans actually literally experience, and they all experience the same thing, and these meditative techniques can create that experience, or it means that she is real. Now, again, if you believe it is, that's fine with me. I don't. But define real. It seems to be, however it's generated, a real mental experience that a lot of people have. And so this is part of the tradition, is to feel that flow of your energy from your Kundalini, which is especially associated with sexual energy, pent up in the base of the spine, up through your body and release it out through your head, and then you can achieve liberation. And again, the people I've talked to who have tried to have this experience, who claim to have it, actually claim it's not a terribly pleasant thing. And one of them actually said, I wish I hadn't tried, because once you start, you kind of have to finish, or it leaves you in this broken state. And I just can't get all the way through, and so I feel pent up, and I wish I hadn't started. So this is one of the reasons that if you're going to do this, you're supposed to do it with a teacher, because if you try to do it on your own, you get into this half-broken state, and it's hard to get out. And so it's actually considered by practitioners as a dangerous thing if it's not guided by a teacher. Which leads us to this left-handed path. Tantra has a right-handed path, which is the things we've just described, where the sexual union is described in symbolic terms. The left-handed path is the approach that is often associated with the more spectacular, because it involves the 5 M's, meaning 5 things that are forbidden. Ritually, they will go out and intentionally do things that they are otherwise forbidden by Hinduism to do, including drinking wine, eating meat, eating fish, eating a certain curdled cereal, and sometimes intoxicating drugs, including cannabis, and sexual intercourse with people that they are not married to. This last bit is what is created in the West especially, either a fascination or repulsion to the idea of Tantra. It either fascinates you or it absolutely disgusts you, depending on what your particular interest in and proclivity is like. So here's how this works. A sacred space is dedicated. A specific day is chosen. You can't do this anytime, anywhere. Participants enter into a ritual bath, dress. They apply cosmetics to each other's body. There's meditation, mantras are spoken for hours, etc. People enter a deep meditative state. They form a circle around the guru and the guru's partner. The female sits on the man's left, which is the traditional position of the goddess relative to the god. This is why it's called left-handed Tantra. I found this picture, by the way, on someone who claims to do retreats, where you can go off and, Anyway. Let's see. Mantras are pronounced and consecrated, and the elements are consecrated to avoid pollution. So the meat, etc., is prayed over and consecrated, and the wine, etc. And then the woman is consecrated as the goddess, and the man is consecrated as the god. And then, as incarnations of the god and goddess, they have sexual union, which becomes a form of worship and devotion to the goddess. They ritually concern the meat, the wine, and have sex. There's several interpretations of this ritual have floated over the years. One is that it's the reenactment of the cosmological union of Shiva and Shakti. That is probably, it's explicit in the ritual and the way they dedicate each other to represent the god and the goddess. Dev and Devi must meet each other. Shiva without Shakti is a corpse. Shakti without Shiva is uncontrolled. And this union brings the desires under control. The other interpretation is that dualism is the problem. And we need to transcend dualism and appropriate the feminine, masculine. The masculine appropriates the feminine has to appropriate the masculine, which is one way of overcoming dualism. But we also have to overcome the dualism of good and evil, right and wrong. And so the idea is these things that are forbidden, like eating meat, isn't actually wrong. It's wrong because of its consequences. So if we do it in a ritually controlled environment where those consequences are curtailed and controlled, then it's not wrong. And what we can do is we can overcome this whole dualistic thinking of right and wrong And we can therefore realize that all things are actually one. There is no kind of right and wrong. Those are labels we apply inappropriately sometimes to the world. We overcome this dualism and this dualistic view of the world by engaging in that which is forbidden and that which is taboo. The other idea is to direct our desires towards liberation rather than repressing them. Denying impulses strengthens them, so we want to harness them instead and apply them to liberation. There's something to that as well. Human sexuality works best when it has an outlet, and if you want to see how poorly celibacy works, view the problems the Catholic Church is having with supposedly celibate priests abusing people. And so when you have a healthy outlet for your sexuality, it's less likely to break out in unhealthy ways. And so the idea here is to take that which is taboo and provide a healthy outlet for it instead of repressing it in a way that will then blow up in your face. And then, of course, you want to awaken the Kundalini and reenact the union of Shiva and Shakti. So those are some of the descriptions of the purpose of this ritual that has been floated over the years. When I teach other religions or study about another religion, there was an Episcopal bishop, who described his approach to comparative religion. And he says, most people engage in religion in an attempt to prove them right and their opponents wrong. So you don't study other religions to learn from them, you study them to prove them wrong. So if you're an atheist, you study religion to prove it's stupid. If you're a Christian, you study Islam to prove that Christianity is better. If you're a Muslim, maybe you study Christianity to prove that Islam is better. And he said, instead, we should search for what we call sacred envy. And he says, what that means isn't that I think they're right. What that means isn't that I'm going to give up my tradition for theirs. It just means we can look at their tradition and say, there's something in it that maybe I can find of value. So it's really easy to look at Tantra and either be enamored of it, if that is the way you are interested in overcoming your own taboos, or just be disgusted by it and say, this is horrendous, this is horrible, I can't believe they do this, and look at the sexism in it, and look at, it's easy to do that. But I want to, every time I approach a religious tradition, especially one that's really different from mine, I want to take just a step back and say, is there anything in here, anything anywhere, that is enviable, that I wish I had in my tradition, that maybe I don't? And one of them in this case is the balance of the male and the female. I think by representing God only as a man, we in the West, in Christianity and Islam and Judaism, we miss out on the truth that there is value in the feminine that we should celebrate. I also really appreciate the idea of the body and the sensations of the body as a source of wisdom, and the mindfulness of the body, whether that's sexual or whether that's in massage, or whether that's just in being present, sitting in your chair, feeling the chair underneath you, and connecting with your body, not as something to be shed and avoided, but as something beautiful and perhaps revelation-giving. This is very different than Paul's view, right, of the flesh lusts against the spirit, and I wish I could escape my flesh. Here we see the flesh and its desires as a potential vehicle for our own liberation. I have sacred envy for that. I also appreciate the idea of sex positivity. Now, it doesn't mean that I think we should all go out and have sacred sexual rituals, but it does mean that seeing sex as a beautiful thing instead of something to be kind of shunned and disgusted by, and maybe we'd even have a picture of something sexual on a temple, is just so counterintuitive to me, to my culture, and everything that comes with it, that I find it refreshing in an interesting and fascinating way. And I'm not, it's not because I want to just, wallow in. So I keep looking for this word and not finding it. Salacious isn't the right word, but just in the taboo and the strange. And it's not that. It's just to see somebody look at normal human intimacy and saying, you know what, there's nothing wrong with that. That's great. And I really wish our tradition looked at human intimacy that way. Our Christian in the West tradition, I mean, as a community and a culture. I think we would have had a lot less problems in our culture if we did. So those are my 3 elements of kind of sacred envy relative to this tradition that we've shared today. Next time, we're going to be done with Hinduism, and we're going to do that by talking about the reaction Hinduism has to Islam, to the invasions of Islam into India, then to the British occupation that follows, to their quest for independence. We'll talk about Gandhi, etc. We'll also talk about their reaction to globalization and to modernity and to the issues of modernity, and they are reacting to it very much like Christians are, by either becoming liberal, as the Unitarian Universalists did, or becoming fundamentalist. And there's a certain polarization between the liberal and the fundamentalist that happens as a reaction to that interaction with modernity. And we'll talk about that next time and be done with Hinduism. And I want to thank you all for coming, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you.